Ladies, gentlemen, they, thems, welcome to this evening's edition of the Private Property Podcast, brought to you proudly by privateproperty.co.za. I'm your host, Sibs Matiela. We're here to discuss all things property. I don't know very much, so we bring in the experts to answer all of your questions. Today, we're discussing buying a property at an auction, and we have an expert, Nkuli Bogopa, who is the COO Property Management at Broll Property Group. Nkuli, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, and thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Sims.
Absolutely. Listen, once there was a psychic who told me I'm going to buy property, when I come into property, and then I must go to an auction, and then I'm going to find that property, and then I'm going to own a home. I suspect the reason I don't have a home yet is because it sounds like a very intimidating thing to do, to go to a property auction. I've never been to one. Can you paint a picture for me, for a first-time home buyer who's looking for a property, now going to an auction to find one? What can one expect there?
Sure. A myriad of scenarios could happen. I've been to a number of property auctions myself. Obviously, as Broll, we run a Broll auctions business, and the buying of property on auction can be a good thing if you know what you're looking for and know what pitfalls to expect. But as a first-time buyer, it can be very, very tricky. And where am I coming from? I think when you're buying a property on auction, you should accept that it is footstoots, as it were. So what you see is what you get. And in this instance, you haven't inspected the property, you are seeing it on paper, and you don't know what to expect. Obviously, working with reputable companies, they will try to compile as much information about the property as possible. However, in an environment that we have in the South African landscape, where the rules that protect the tenants are so stringent, or current occupiers, I've also seen the nightmare of a residential property auction where someone buys off the auction a residential property and the occupant inside the property refuses to walk away,
Wow.
So that's the downside. And you then have to go through the legal battle of having to make sure that you evict the person. In the meantime, they could be vandalizing the property and block you from accessing the property. So those are some of the pitfalls. However, on the positive side, you're obviously getting a property at a price that is lower than what the market would be. And if you act very quickly and you have the right amount of money in your pocket, it's a deal and a transaction that can be concluded quite quickly.
Nkuli, Broll Properties have obviously been leaders in this sector for a very long time. I'm curious as to why a property would come to be auctioned off in the first place. And now when Broll Property gets involved, how do you assist a potential buyer who's currently now chasing said property at an auction?
Sure. So a property can go on auction for a various number of reasons. So a buyer might want to sell the property quickly and doesn't have the time to wait for the market to go through its stages. As you know, the cycle of the market could be a buyer's market or a seller's market, and there could be a lot of stock in the market, and therefore you find it difficult to sell quickly enough. So in some instances, we refer to them as private treaties, where you're just selling through the auction route, but it's not because you are distressed in any way as the seller. It's simply because you would like to have a transaction go through really quickly. And how we prepare the buyers in the auctions division, and I must say that I'm in the property management division, not the auctions division, but some of what happens is that obviously they prepare a deck on as much information as possible about the property, take pictures, so that as they present it to you as the potential buyer, you are able to have as much information about the property as possible. And then there would be some kind of a reserve price to the property to make sure that it doesn't get to sell under what the market is acceptable. And I think that in the successful property transactions that I've seen, most of the commercial ones are pretty straightforward. If you're buying a commercial property, of an auction. You know who the tenants are, the leases that are attached to it, and so there are very rarely surprises in the instance where you are buying a commercial property rather than on the residential side. It gets very tricky. Yeah.
I'm curious as to whether, so I know what you're hearing. Sorry, I hear what you're saying about the, trying to make sure that something isn't sold below market. And I suppose as someone who doesn't know anything, you just assume that someone was in distress, then their house got taken away by the bank, and now you can go to the auction and you're all bidding there 1 rand, 2 rand, 50 rand for a mansion in Benoni. I don't know.
Yeah. I think in response to that, I recall some 3 years back or a little bit more, there was a class action against auctioneers selling properties, or banks, for instance, selling properties below what is acceptable. And in that instance, what is acceptable would be you cannot sell a property for 5 rands or 100 rands, when in fact the bond owed on the property is still like 1 million rands, and you expect the person that you are that is being evicted out of the property to still settle 1 million rands worth of a bond, when in fact you put it on the market for 5 rands. So I'm not sure about the legalities of that class action, but in as far as we are working, there's a reserve price, and every property has a value of sorts, and that is the reserve price that you would then use to go to market with. If you can get higher, of course, then that's what you get at an auction. But the seller will decide if they are prepared to take anything lower than the actual reserve price.
That makes a lot of sense. Nkuli, I'm driving around on a Saturday morning, and then there I am, and then I'm like, oh, here's an auction. Maybe I can go get my hands on a property really quickly on this sunny Saturday morning while I'm running my errands. Can I get in? What do I need to have to be able to now attend a property auction and be there? I imagine you raise the things, ne? The little paddles with your number on.
Yeah.
Is it like that?
So you can, in some instances, I know there are companies where you need to pre-register, and they know that you are coming to attend the auction, and you put a deposit down. In some instances, you can see the sign and just show up for the auction and register upon arrival, so they will take a deposit from you, and in order to know and be sure that you are here to participate at the auction. And when the auction starts, then as the lot is being introduced and they give you information about the lot, usually they'll even have a brochure that they will send to you when you register or if you arrive on the day and you register, they'll give you the brochure showing you all the lots that are on auction for the day. And then you are able, in some instances, you're actually even able to pre-reserve, and say, I'm interested on this one and that one. So, you make sure that you are in the room at the time when that transaction happens, and it doesn't happen without you. But there are a lot of rules that surround how to run an auction, and I'm not an expert in that in terms of, callers, because now they do it hybrid. People are in the room, some people are online.
Yeah.
And they bidding telephonically, etc., etc. So everybody's price has to be heard in the room, so that the seller the highest price can then be the one that gets accepted. And you better be ready that once you have put up your flag and you have your bid has been accepted, that you will be able to fulfill the financial obligations that follow, because those are contractually binding. So you may then have to put a X amount of payment down and then seek the rest, and you have to do it and turn it around within a set number of days. So that you have to be able to stick with and be confident that you have that kind of financial backing, because you've essentially removed the opportunity for someone else to partake in that auction or in that transaction. But I've watched, in other instances where A lady walked in and she wasn't really prepared to buy anything, but the deal was so good. She put her hand up and she bought the property. And by the time we finished the auction, she already had an offer from someone in the room saying, please, actually, now I've thought about it. I should have put my hand up. I want that property. Can I offer you 50K on top of what you offered? So she could make an instant 50,000 rands just like that. So it just depends. And you do want to look out for the reputable companies running these auctions, because then you know they're not bringing you stock that is going to be difficult when it's sitting in your own hands. Yeah.
I'm so glad you spoke about being prepared, because I mean, other than this lady who got the 50K, that's the only reason I would go now, because I'd probably only have $500 in my bank account. What kind of buyer would you
You
suggest?
and I both.
Yeah, no, it's fine. We're collecting our coins one coin at a time. We'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
But in your
Yeah.
experience, what kind of buyer would you suggest now attend an auction? Obviously not Sibs with only 500 Rand in her bank account. If they're going to ask me for a deposit at the door and I'm like, will you guys take an IOU?
Yeah. Yeah, doesn't work. Yeah. So I think ideally you would want to be prepared in the form of having been pre-approved by your bank, having a knowing that the bank is ready to back you up. Of course, that's if you are buying with a bond. Otherwise, if you are a cash buyer, then make sure that those funds are readily available within a number of days for you to be able to draw on them. Of course, for many people like myself and yourself who are brown, we usually don't have that kind of money readily available in cash. So the best option is to make sure that you are pre-approved by your bank and you know what the bond amount would be. Although because it's an auction, there would still be a cash component that you are in for, depending on the size of the property and the value of the property. Yeah.
Nkuli, thank you so much for your time and all of your insights. This is such an interesting topic and we must talk about it some more, because there's still a lot to explore here. But I think that's where we'll leave it for now, because it's a lot to take in. I really appreciate your input and your insights on this topic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
You as well. There you have it, Nkuli Bogopa from Broll Properties telling us about the do's and don'ts of trying to buy a property on auction. That's today's episode. I'll be back tomorrow. Join us for more on the Private Property Podcast, brought to you proudly by privateproperty.co.za. I'm your host, Sibs Matiela, and I'll see you tomorrow night.